My name is Richard McCoy. I'm a conservator of objects and variable art at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And I had the real honor of putting this panel together as a way to explore notions around preserving digital art within the structure of a museum, and sort of trying to find ways to do that in a systematic way and in a way that can be passed on to other museums. And I did it because I don't really know as much as I think I know about it. And so what I wanted to do was to try to find some smart and innovative people to come and talk about it. And so I'm here just as much to learn about it as anyone. And I'm really thrilled to have that opportunity. And then just before I introduce folks, I want to say is that we're actually short one person today. We were to have Jeff Martin, who is a private conservator based in Chicago, who also works a lot for the Hirshhorn Museum. Unfortunately, he isn't able to come here today, but we're going to try our best to make up for his absence. But I'm joined on the panel by Goodyear, who is a curator at the National Portrait Gallery, Penelope Umbrico, who is an artist and photographer based in New York, and Mr. Koven Smith, who I think everyone here knows at the Denver Art Museum. But just to say a bit, is that I have up here on the screen this is the homepage for the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art in North America. And this is an organization that is somewhat new here in the United States. It's an organization for which I serve on the program committee. And it's a non-membership based organization, but it's one that's dedicated to raising awareness and finding issues around conserving contemporary art in North America. It's an offshoot of a larger organization that's based in Europe. And so we have a real great leadership team and board of directors and an equally great program committee. Along with myself on the program committee, you all may know Rosanna Flauty, who is involved with MCN, and a couple other conservators around and other folks. And so it's a group that's really dedicated to investigating issues of contemporary art. And so they've sponsored this panel. And so I just wanted to say thanks to INCCA, my organization, and to hope that it continues to raise the dialogue around conserving contemporary art. This program actually fits in a program stream that we have. There's 3 program streams within INCCA. One is that we're doing workshops teaching museum professionals how to interview artists. And so we have workshops going around teaching folks how to artist interview methodology. And then we have this project called Voice of the Artist, where we bring artists in conversation with museum professionals and collections care specialists to work through issues. And then we have another project called the Artist Research Project, which is just launching this year. And the project is prizing Tony Smith's work as a place to accumulate as much information and knowledge as we can around Tony Smith's artwork. And we've launched a lot of things about that. Please check out the webpage at INCCA-NA.org, and they're also on Twitter. So that's my little bit of housekeeping and plug for INCCA North America. But to start the panel, we're going to have Goodyear give some of her experiences in the National Portrait Gallery and talk about some of the initiatives that are happening at Smithsonian, and then we'll turn it to Penelope. And finally, Koven and I will have some more sort of discussive comments, but along the way, we really hope that you have something to say and you'll have some really good questions, and we can have an excellent dialogue, both here and if you're on Twitter. And so I think the hashtag for this conference is MCN 2012 Cons. So
for this session.
The session, right, thank you. And so with that, I am going to turn this over to Anne.
Great. Well, Richard, thank you so much for organizing this panel. And Penelope and Koven, thanks to you and everyone who is assembled. It's really a wonderful opportunity and a pleasure to have this opportunity to consider together with everyone here new challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for curators seeking to oversee and curate digital media artworks. First, I'd like to start with a very fundamental question, and this is to discuss the issue of terminology. Just what do we mean by digital art? And what is encompassed under this umbrella term? Other descriptors that might be applied are variable media art or time-based art, and as you'll hear, I'll be using these terms interchangeably during my presentation. The first thing that may jump out at you about each of these phrases is precisely that the question of the materiality of the artwork itself is not specified. Indeed, the Guggenheim Museum has defined variable media art, and I quote, as an artwork independent of its medium. In fact, each of these basically synonymous terms gets at notions of changeability, variation, temporality, novelty, as opposed to something familiar, the digital as opposed to the analog or fixed. Privileging the notion of changeability or duration over a specific medium enables these terms to encompass a broad range of artworks with digital components, or even works that might be digitized for long-term preservation, including film, video, digital animation, or even digital stills. We might think of these works as something for which an electronic interface and repository is critical to exhibition and long-term survival. Such artworks, then, are not tangible in a traditional sense, which raises many practical and philosophical questions, which I find quite fascinating as a curator. Many of you are no doubt well acquainted with Walter Benjamin's famous 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Published over 3/4 of a century ago, Benjamin's influential piece grapples with the implications of the introduction of yet another previously new technological medium into the arena of art making, the photograph. While nearly a century had passed since the invention of the photograph by the time Benjamin penned his remarks, the broader implications of its importance, both for the dissemination of information as well as for the creation of new art forms such as film, were just beginning to clarify themselves. The epigraph with which Benjamin opened his essay, a lengthy quotation from Paul Valéry's The Conquest of Ubiquity of 1928, is worth quoting in full in our present context. As Valéry wrote, "In all the arts, there is a physical component which can no longer be considered or treated as it used to be, which cannot remain unaffected by our modern knowledge and power. For the last 20 years, neither matter nor space nor time has been what it was from time immemorial. We must expect great innovations to transform the entire technique of the arts, thereby affecting artistic innovation itself, and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art." The same, of course, might be said today about time-based and digital media art. And just as in the case of Benjamin and the photograph, while time-based and digital media are not brand new, with histories stretching back 4, 5, or even 10 decades, their implications are now raising unprecedented questions and shifting fundamental assumptions about the nature of art and its preservation. Today, my goal will be to offer the perspective of a curator at the National Portrait Gallery on the philosophic, aesthetic, and practical implications of collecting and exhibiting time-based or variable media art for the Smithsonian, as well as to address some of the critical practical considerations that make this possible and future challenges to be addressed. Today, most of the Smithsonian art museums collect time-based art, and all of these units exhibit it. Smithsonian holdings of time-based media art are substantial, approaching 200 such pieces, and range in date from the mid-1960s to the present. Such artwork represents a diverse range of formats and delivery mechanisms, from film and projectors to television and film, or to television and video, as suggested by these works by Paul Sharits and Namjoon Paik in the collection of the Hirshhorn, to animation, such as The History of the Main Complaint by William Kentridge, which has been digitized at the National Museum of African Art, to less traditional materials, such as video projected against turkey feathers in Mespit by Alan Michelson at the National Museum of the American Indian. They also include programmed LED displays exhibiting words and recorded images, like these pieces by Jenny Holzer and Jim Campbell at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, to digital projections and generative video, as in these portraits by Jason Salavon and Lincoln Schatz at the National Portrait Gallery. At the NPG, it's our firm contention that the collecting of such works brings an important new dimension to our ability to describe contemporary art and biography, allowing us in the instance of Jason Salavon's Late Night Triad, for example, to present key broadcast figures in the environment through which they are largely known to the public. Jason Salavon's Late Night Triad, of course, captures David Letterman, Jay Leno, and Conan O'Brien. And I want to just share with you quickly a brief clip from the work. Yeah, perfect.
Oh, so there's no mic, so we're just going to bend this one down. Right.
And the sound, like the images, has a sort of blurry quality. You're looking at 64 continual nights layered on top of each other.
Seriously? Yeah. I'm sorry, and I think I realized that there's no speakers here. I think the sound just goes back to there. So it was just to describe the sound for a second, it was I don't know if you all could hear it, but it was sort of the crowd noise sort of rising and falling.
And so one of the things that actually fascinates me about this piece, although it was made less than a decade ago and collected by our institution in 2008 after having been exhibited in 2006, is that it already exhibits some really intriguing historical features. I'm sure you recognize the 4:3 aspect ratio of quote-unquote standard television, which has now disappeared with the popularization of high-definition television. The analog signal, as I mentioned earlier, was digitized by the artist at the time he made the piece. And one of our important considerations in collecting this piece has been to work with the artist to figure out what are the aspects of it that we need to ensure remain intact. Most important to Jason is that we retain that standard aspect ratio of 4:3, and that we maintain that a specific ratio between each of the sitters who you saw in the piece. As a result, we end up projecting that artwork. We can't exhibit it on plasma screens until such time as we're able to honor the artist's intentions to preserve a certain look for that particular artwork. If digital media then have the capacity both to reflect and perhaps also to shape new trends in the arts and new ways of understanding the self and society at large, what does it mean to collect them for the museum? I've hinted at this already, but I do want to point out that all of the time-based and digital works that I've shown thus far have been made using different technologies, many of which were new and groundbreaking at the time they were employed by the artists. It is the goal of institutions, however, to provide for their long-term survival. And as a curator, the ability to ensure this is critical to bringing such works into the museum. To this end, one of the things I find most interesting about time-based media is the degree to which they transform traditional paradigms for collecting and preserving artworks. Unlike most objects, time-based art cannot be left indefinitely in a sheltered environment. The medium threatens to degrade. Nor, unlike paintings, sculpture, photographs, or works on paper, do we necessarily want its material properties to remain unchanged. To do so may be to lose access to it. We must then understand the time-based work as something for which regular monitoring and most likely evolution is essential. Perhaps even more interesting is the broad infrastructure for the acquisition, installation, and preservation of these works. Indeed, care models must be understood as being team-based. In the fall of 2009, the Smithsonian's Time-Based Media Working Group formed as part of a grassroots initiative to address the fascinating technical and intellectual questions caught up in the acquisition, installation, and long-term care of digital and time-based art. Since that time, our group has sponsored various symposia and roundtables about the preservation of time-based media art and is now exploring the desirability of establishing standards specific to the preservation of time-based media art, distinct from those used to care for archival collections. The primary premises and goals of the group are described in this particular slide, and these are some of the observations we made, and some of you may find the same thing at your own institutions, that time-based and digital art represents one of the fastest growing areas of Smithsonian fine arts collections. At present, few guidelines exist governing their care and maintenance. So as a result, our interdisciplinary and pan-institutional working group aims to assess Smithsonian digital and time-based collections to determine what short and long-term care strategies are best implemented institutionally. With its interdisciplinary strengths, the Smithsonian really provides an ideal laboratory to establish preservation protocols, which will protect Smithsonian collections care and which we feel have the potential to serve as a model for professional colleagues and individuals internationally, we hope. So as a result, we're working to develop interdisciplinary collaborations with colleagues in information technology, archival management, and related fields to research both digital and physical repositories for these collections. Keeping in mind the importance of such a team-based approach to the preservation of new media, many of the Smithsonian museums have established in-house interdisciplinary working groups to address these challenges. At NPG, we have created DAGGER, the Digital Art Group Roundtable. The team meets monthly to cut through red tape and to
what was that again?
DAGGER.
What does that stand for?
Digital Art Group Roundtable. And so we meet monthly to discuss questions related to the documentation, installation, and long-term care of our time-based and other digital assets. The group includes all of the relevant stakeholders: curators, registrars, the head of exhibitions, conservators, and information specialists. Among the outcomes of our collaborative work has been to ingest into the Smithsonian DAMs Jason Salavon's Late Night Triad, the first work of fine art to be stored in this digital repository. It represents a test case for us to explore both the protocols and to test functionality associated with the DAMs and the migration of works of art for the purpose of preservation. We have done this with the full knowledge and cooperation of the artist, because like us, Jason realizes that in order to survive, his work cannot remain fixed. This brings in another dimension of the care of time-based or digital media work, which is the importance of well-thought-out, legally sound agreements with the artist and/or dealer from which the artwork is acquired. Just what changes is an artist or his or her representative willing to accept in the interests of ensuring the long-term survival of the work, and what are the parameters that must be understood as being essential to maintain, such as aspect ratio, the rate at which an image plays, the environment in which it is encountered. In other words, just what are the defining elements of the work or its significant values? These must be carefully hammered out during the process of acquiring the work. It is also worth pointing out that the long-term care of works of digital and time-based art clearly requires an intelligent attention to institutional capabilities. Just what is required to care for the work? And does your unit, or rather museum, I should say, unit is Smithsonian speak, and does your museum have easy access to these resources, be they equipment, knowledge, or storage capacity? For this reason, it is critical that in acquiring technologically dependent works of art, curators negotiate ahead of time, as I've mentioned, with the artist or other entity from which the piece is being acquired, so that anticipated short and long-term costs above and beyond the value of the work itself, as well as care strategies, may be shared with one's colleagues and ultimately with one's board of directors, which may be called upon, after all, to invest in these works. But if the methods of caring for digital and time-based work force us to revise our standard assumptions and operating procedures, requiring curators to work outside of traditional channels to ensure the long-term viability and survival of these collections, it should still be stressed that curatorial training and education in the history of art play an important role in establishing the parameters around which to document, interpret, and ultimately preserve them. This includes the careful documentation of materials used to produce works of art, questions regarding the artist's intent, and regarding the way in which the artist understands these artworks as part of a longer tradition of artistic practice. Not all of the philosophical questions raised by digital media are unprecedented, though some of them may present themselves in new ways. With his introduction of the ready-made, of which the fountain may be the most famous example nearly a century ago, and the development in the mid-20th century of his Boiron valise, composed of miniature reproductions of the objects he considered to be among his most important, Marcel Duchamp clearly demonstrated that it is the idea behind a work of art that is most critical, even more so than its physical manifestation, an insight that subsequent generations of artists have embraced, even taken for granted. This principle may be key to reconciling ourselves to the need to permit the reproduction and migration of works of art in order to protect them for future generations. In the mid-1960s, Saul LeWitt famously referred to the idea as the machine that makes the work, and his wall drawings, such as wall drawing number 65, are generally the product of the implementation of a set of rules by skilled workers. And you see here the progression from the certificate of instructions to its installation recently by artists to its final installation at the National Gallery of Art. Therefore, if we understand the principles or code behind a work of art, can we then effectively recreate it as an authentic artistic expression of a creator who is no longer present? LeWitt's example would suggest that the answer is yes, if the artist believes so and conforms his or her practice to that principle. Indeed, might we be able to productively reconceptualize the digital art, particularly that which is designed for long-term migration, as allographic versus autographic? As the philosopher Nelson Goodman explains, a work of art is autographic, and I quote, if the most exact duplication of it does not count as genuine. An allographic work, such as a music score or a poem, has no one acceptable instance, or, as Goodman puts it, all correct performances or renditions of the work are equally genuine instances of it. Allographic art we may thereby define as rule-bound. Has the work of art in the digital era become akin to a symphony or a publication? It is the aim of artists, curators, conservators, technologists, and perhaps even legal specialists to sort out the implications of such questions going forward. While history and philosophy provide an important intellectual scaffolding through which to understand the claims and demands of art executed in variable or digital media, we must acknowledge that the physical infrastructures of the art with which we are now dealing raise critical practical concerns. These include the need for a viable technical infrastructure to exhibit the work, the risk of technical obsolescence if team-based care strategies are not implemented right away, and the importance of documenting and addressing the artist's intentions and other questions related to intellectual property. Variable media artworks have both unprecedented resilience in terms of the ability to replicate and disseminate them, and fragility in terms of their propensity to disintegrate if not properly monitored. Recognizing the value of capturing and disseminating best practices in the collecting, exhibiting, and care of time-based art, the Smithsonian's Time-Based and Digital Media Working Group is actively engaged in identifying best practices, particularly with smaller institutions in mind. In addition to the development of public programming, we are developing a website providing information about our activities, as well as resources and guidance for the care of variable media art. I want to share with you screen grabs from the beta version of a website now under development. While each artwork must ultimately be addressed on a case-by-case basis, There are some general rules of thumb to acquiring and caring for time-based art, which we have attempted to identify and systematize. These include developing pre-acquisitions worksheets to assess care needs and associated costs, questions that are valuable to explore with artists, and cataloging worksheets for time-based art. The opportunity to collect, exhibit, and preserve digital and time-based art at the Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian more broadly, and elsewhere thus provides an exceptional opportunity to consider the philosophical implications of these new media for understanding our world and ourselves, as well as to explore the technical and intellectual challenges of preserving these works for future audiences. It's an exciting area with tremendous potential to benefit from ongoing interdisciplinary collaboration. And your feedback and suggestions regarding our efforts at the Smithsonian will be greatly welcome as we continue to work on this question of the care of digital media art more broadly. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That was an outstanding description of the framework for all of the issues that are. Can I pass that on to you? For all the issues related to this topic. And I'm really excited now to hand this over to Penelope. I've gotten to know her a little bit over the past couple weeks, actually a month or so, in talking about this panel. And I quickly became to see, and I hope this is fair, Penelope, as her work as a kind of a metaphor for being a museum. And I say that because what she does is that she goes and engages different websites and collects images from them, for example, from Flickr or Craigslist, and then reinterprets those and remixes them into her own artwork. And so, in a way, she is burdened with a similar problem that museums have, and that she must contain all of those images she's collected, and then to repurpose them as a kind of artwork. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity for Penelope to kind of give us what we talked about was a kind of behind-the-scenes look at an artist talk. And I think that, is to say, if she would talk a little bit about her working process. And so I think this is a rare opportunity. And at that point, I turn it over to Penelope. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this. It's really, I've already learned so much being here. It's really fantastic. We can't, so I need to get to the, here we are. I have to mirror them, I guess.
It's also interesting to say is that Penelope's work has been exhibited widely in a variety of ways and is collected. And we talked, for example, there's a piece that was recently acquired by SF MoMA and in a few other places.
I'm going to talk about those.
Great. We can see it fine now.
Yeah, great. So first I'm going to read just a paragraph. I have notes in my sketchbook and notes on my iPhone, and then my presentation here. I guess I'll put this full screen. And it's not quite fitting, but I guess that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to start with a premise, these few points that are a kind of premise for my work. One is that still images are not still anymore. You were talking about moving images. I'm going to really talk about still images, even though I have worked with time-based media. But so still images are not still anymore. No longer are they tied to any particular substrate or file extension. They're continually moving and forever changing. So we all know that, but these are the premises that I'm starting with. The image torrent is alive and emergent, and it defies any fixed place or time. The sheer quantity and accessibility of digital images that we all produce and consume neutralizes personal meaning in the work. It neutralizes particularity. There is no individual or no local, and everything becomes collective, abstract, distant, and global. So this may be true or it may not be true. This is a premise that I'm working with. And then all images, whether they're artful or authored or utilitarian or unauthored, I just realized I'm not talking into the mic. Is that all right? And I just lost my place. Okay. Are anonymous and and unassignable. And are unlimited in this exchange of information. And this undisciplined, non-hierarchical archive is a collective index, and it represents us, so it becomes an auto-portrait. The previously indexical nature of photography, or the assumed indexical nature of photography, now has shifted from descriptive truth to accumulative data. And I think of this as a kind of Borgesian map. And so within this set of premises is where I take a stance as a kind of documentary photographer, and I move through this world looking for meaningful subjects, and I find them in this space. So this is an example of one project where I found on eBay tons of images of mini photo labs for sale. And the fact that they're for sale means that they're not useful anymore to the owners. They're trying to get rid of them. And the thing that I was most struck with was that these objects once were, you know, they kind of promised a speedy delivery of the photograph. You would take your photographs, bring your negatives in, and get your prints back in an hour. And that was like so slick and fast and economical and speedy. And the photographer who's taking these pictures can't take a picture. They can't even fit these big things into the photographic frame. They're so big and clunky now, you know. And they're for sale and out of commission. And the thing that really struck me the most about them then was that the person who owns these is taking a photograph of these objects that make a photograph, and then posting them on eBay where I'm finding them, so that the photograph completely bypasses the machine that was made to print them. So there's like this kind of the maker no longer has connection with its creative progeny or something like this. So I actually made a set of pictures of them. This one I have a note here. It's printed on a Noritsu 34 Pro with Kodak paper. Just because the materiality of it to me was very important, that these objects, these photographs, the image you're seeing did not have a substrate. They were just digital files that I was finding.
Did you print them in an hour?
I should have. I actually printed them at Adorama because here's one of those things about these printers. If you have good people looking after them, you get uniform results, whereas if you take them to Target, sometimes they're, you know, so. And this project is relevant to this other project that you had mentioned, Sons from Flickr, which I will show. Partly because I'm interested in photography. Photography is the subject of my work as well as it is, you know, I use photography, but it's also the subject of my work. So, and at some point I was searching on Flickr to find out what is the most photographed subject, and I did searches for kittens and flowers and landscapes and water, and you know, and sunset was the most, at the time in 2006, was the most photographed subject, which to me was really interesting because the sun, you know, we have one sun that we do in our world, and it lives up in this infinite space, and the fact that millions of people or hundreds, thousands actually in this case, were taking photographs of the sun and then putting them online in this very cold electronic space. And cold, by what I mean by cold is it's not, well, I mean, of course there are servers that get very hot and need to be cooled off, but the electronic signal is a blue signal as opposed to a red, warm signal like the sun, which has a warm, vitamin D, happiness, everything about the spirituality about the sun, and here we are online looking at the sun. So I thought I would just take the sun, the idea of the sun, and crop from all of these images 4x6 snapshots. And I uploaded them to Flickr. So I got these all from Flickr. And of course here also, I became very aware in 2006, this was when, well, I became very aware that I was reliant on other people's tagging of images to be able to find them. So it became a kind of collaborative project, I felt, with Flickr and me. So I uploaded them back onto Flickr because I felt like, well, these are very small fragments of much larger pictures, of course. So if you had taken any of these pictures on Flickr and found your image here, you wouldn't recognize it. But I wanted to put it back onto Flickr as a kind of social exchange project in a certain way. And then I also uploaded them to Kodak Gallery, which I took this screenshot of Kodak Gallery last night and put it in here. And this is one of those things of like not knowing, like the kind of the obsolescence of different kinds of, so we have the 1 hour photo labs that maybe will no longer be around in 10 years. We also have Kodak Gallery, which just closed a couple of months ago, and I didn't have the foresight to take a picture of the equivalent of my Flickr page on my Flickr Kodak site. So it's lost, I don't have it. And there's one of those things of, well, how do we preserve if your practice is, if the process of it is as much a part of the work as the object is in the end, then you have to be absolutely cognizant of the fact that it might not be, always it might not, if I made a painting and the house burnt down, the painting would disappear. This is sort of like that. I lost my Kodak page.
Can you just say what you thought or felt when you noticed all your images were gone?
Well, they told us that they were going to migrate, that they were like putting all our stuff to Snapfish. And I just wasn't interested in getting images from Snapfish. I liked the idea that I was uploading them to Kodak. They were called Easy Share Pictures, and Kodak was like the inventor of the Kodak moment. So I really wanted these to be from Kodak. So now I get them printed other places, other 1 hour photo labs, but I didn't think then that I would need or want a screenshot of my Kodak page. Because the work was this. The work was the actual installations of the prints. And so there's one of those things of like, oh God, I wish I had done that, what I did on the Flickr page when I still had the Kodak.
But for the sake of this talk, that's better. That they're all gone.
You've made our point.
Yes, all right.
I prefer this.
Okay. You don't want to look at that anymore?
Yeah.
So this is what I got back from Kodak, and these are 4x6 snapshots on glossy Kodak paper. If we turn the lights down a little bit, you'd be able to see them because it's a pretty good projector.
Let's try it.
Go for it, man.
Can we turn it down a bit?
Don't anybody get handsy.
So you can see it's like looking at the sun. But what I liked about this project was, well, I'll just go back to this, that what I'm giving you here is a very small detail of 2,000, an installation of 2,000 4x6 snapshots of larger sunset pictures that I've taken from Flickr. And really what's the affect of this is this idea of the multiple sun and that I found online versus the singular sun that we have in our physical world. And that everybody is taking pictures of, like everybody in this room I'm sure has taken a picture of a sunset. I'm curious if there's anybody who hasn't, could you please put up your hand? Okay, and so one of the things that was really important about this project for me was that, I'll just say quickly on this image that this was the first installation in a museum at the Brisbane Museum Gallery of Modern Art in 2008, and I had asked them to send me a photograph, documentation photograph, and they didn't right away, and I got anxious, and so I went on Google and I did a Google search, Penelope Umbrico, Brisbane Museum of Art, or Gallery of Art, and I found this image on Flickr. So I loved this recursiveness of somebody being there, just taking this photograph, and it's a beautiful photograph. I actually contacted him and asked him if I could use it, so it's one of my press pictures. So right here is a list of, this is the one, actually that was in 2007 at Brisbane, so this is the one in Brisbane. So the very first search I did on Flickr in 2006, which kind of floored me, there were 554, whatever, you can read that first number.
It's a big number.
It's a big number. And like a year later, there were 2 million. And I thought, okay, well, when I install this, I have to title the installation, the number of sunsets there are tagged on Flickr at the time that I make the installation. And then that becomes a kind of register of the ubiquity of photo sharing and the relationship we have to this singular event. No, sorry, this multiple event that happens once a day at a very specific time every day, but with one object. So everybody around the world is taking these pictures all at the same time, and then it gets recorded. I record how many people are sharing them each time I do an installation. So the last installation I did, there were 10,291,376 pictures on Flickr, and a week ago there were 11,000, and today there are 27,000 more images on Flickr than there was last week of sunsets. So, that gives you a sense of the kind of sublime number. Like, it's incalculable, really. Or it's calculable, but I don't know. You can't understand it, really. I can't really understand that. So that's why I decided to use these numbers as part of so they're called that number suns from Flickr partial, because I would never have that many. I would just be insane. And then this was an installation at SF MoMA, and SF MoMA bought 1,440 of these to fit on, they wanted to do an installation for their 75th year anniversary, and of all the work they own, and so they wanted this to be in the show, so they bought it. So basically they bought the files. So what I had to do is, I'm going to show you now what the files look like. Okay, so see, this is not fitting on here, so let me make this a bit smaller. Does that fit?
I think they get a sense of it.
Okay,
also.
so this is my files as they are cropped and ready to be uploaded to Kodak or somewhere. So there's, you can read here, in this folder there's only 2013. I have 2,500. This is just an older folder. So that's all of them. And then for SF MoMA, I took those same files and renumbered them, arranged them in an order that I liked, and then renumbered them 1 to 0001 to 01440. So this is all of theirs. I'll make them smaller so you get it. So this is the whole 1,440 images, and I'm showing you this because they're the same files exactly as these files, except that I renumbered them, and I renumbered them according to an arrangement that I thought if they were hung 1 to 65, I think it was, and then second row to 65, they would make a really nice pattern. And so this numbering and this particular number, which one is it? I think it's this one here, is the number that SF MoMA owns plus the naming of those particular files.
So could someone else acquire a next version of it and get this? Could they have the same file, but it would be named differently?
Yes, they could have the same file. No two installations will ever look the same, because you could, but that wouldn't be part of the work. They would get an image that's printed from the same files, but SF MoMA owns those files numbered in a particular order that is relevant to a kind of aesthetic that I chose at that time. Plus, they bought the number of sunset. They bought that number along with the thing. The other thing that they did was so I provided them with one set of prints to install, and because this is an installational work, they get glued up onto the wall and then they get taken down. So they also bought JPEGs for printing so they can upload them to Kodak Gallery themselves. And they also bought TIFFs because TIFFs are more stable, I guess, than JPEGs. So They have a set of TIFFs and they have a set of JPEGs of the 1,440 images. And but the reason the 1 Hour Photo Lab project is kind of relevant to this is that if we don't have 1 Hour Photo Labs anymore, this project cannot be reinstalled. So they, I would imagine that what they would, if they were going to take this seriously, they would have to make multiple sets of it for all the possible installations that they think they'll ever do at SF MoMA, and then keep one in cold storage as well, and this is an installation. I'll just show you now a little bit like what has happened with this project. This was an installation at the New York Photo Festival, and I gave a talk at the New York Photo Festival about this work, and there was a Flickr discussion board at the same time. I actually put these black lines through here because I didn't want this to be about the individuals having the conversation. And so one of the other things that this project actually raises is this notion of the individual in relation to the subject that the individual is photographing. And how do we choose to photograph something, and what kinds of scripts do we follow? And when those scripts are so pervasive, like, the millions and millions of photographs that we see every day, what, how much choice we have in those, and how much authorship do we have in our choices to make images. And I loved this discussion because they were mad at me. They had been to my talk. They were really mad at me for stealing images from Flickr. And one of them says her claim is that nobody owns the circle of the sun. I think she's being dishonest, at least with herself, and lazy, not even showing the courtesy to ask people if she can use their work. There, I said it, although I like this work amongst the very best in the show. And I just thought, wow, that's really, that it had to do with the sunset. Like, everybody takes pictures of sunsets. Everybody participates in this thing. What's so great about the sunset is that we all do it. And not that we do it as an individual and we author an image that nobody else has authored, but that in fact the exact opposite, that we all do it together with everybody. It's like this great kind of spiritual thing in a sense, that we can all appreciate this thing and make the same image and not worry about it. So I felt like her argument is kind of counterintuitive, and then also, well, especially to my work, also the idea of attribution makes no sense in relation to that. So that actually, I did this other project that I went onto stock sites and found sunsets on stock sites where the watermark was right over the circle of the sun. And these are, the names of these are the tags that the stock images the tags that the stock images have. So you can see that the sun itself is a very small fragment of what I'm taking, of the entire image, like a romantic couple holding hands at sunset on beach, pregnant woman holding belly against sun. The pregnant woman holding belly thing is at sunset is like a huge photo meme. Yeah. So then on Flickr, I found this person who's mad at that, taken from Penelope Umbrico's portfolio, copyrighted Suns, inverted, right-click, save as, points to the blatant disregard for creative copyright in screen grabbing legally protected images and using them in a new work without proper licensing. The work also summarizes the collective narrative of the many photographers trying to make a living by creating beautiful imagery and finding a protected means to distribute their photos. So, and he says, I have not contracted legal departments. So if he does, I guess I'm in trouble. But this person, he or she, took my image from my website and reversed it, and then, but he's giving me attribution, which is, But what I love also is that at the same time as I found this, I also found this, because I have this Google, I have a Google, what's it called? I put my name in the Google alert, yeah. And so whenever my work shows up somewhere, I get to see what's going on around it. And so this is on one of the stock companies. It's this one big stock, and I have lots of those here. So big stock, made this collage. One of the editors or something at Big Stock made this collage of the solar eclipse that happened on May 18th or May 19th, May 17th, and then said here, above collage made from Big Stock's own collection is an homage to artist Penelope Umbrico's amazing sun's image. So, Big Stock is not worried about it, so I thought I'd add that in. I just loved that this company that, I'm actually taking things from. And there's another trope that this is an image that that I actually printed like this, as with the files and everything. Another project that I did with it is called Sunburn Screensaver. So, so the idea is that if you actually really did need a screensaver anymore, this would actually burn a hole through your screen. But in fact, we don't need screensavers, even though we probably all have screensavers. And so the screensaver actually uses more energy than it would if your computer just went to sleep. So it's kind of a comment on that, using the sun. And then another project, so this refers back to the 1 hour photo lab. On de-installation, I've asked in different places for people to send me back the suns. So I find these online in this kind of electronic virtual space, print them out as physical objects, and then put a stamp on them with my address on them, and then they fly over the world. And I love that these photographs become this, they have this journey back home, sort of the way the sun actually would travel over the earth. So these are some of the postcards, some of the photographs I've gotten back from various places all over the world. And
you ask museums to send you back, just like when they take it off the wall?
Yeah, just put a stamp, yeah. And actually there's a museum in Portland that sent me a whole bunch, the Lewis and Clark. Some of these are from Brazil, some of these are from SF MoMA, some of them are from Daegu. Because also when I go and install something, or if someone else is installing them, I give the curators, I print more images than you need, because you want to kind of play with them and make an interesting thing. So they're not always on de-installation, they're often just right after. So these are the objects that I get. And this is the same postcards, but like images of them on Second Life. So, a lot of the work has to do with the difference between materiality and immateriality, and you're all familiar with Second Life, right? Do you guys know what Second Life, does anybody? Yeah, okay. So I thought the sun on Second Life, since Second Life does not really have a sun, I would use the image of the sun as a kind of detritus, and I put it around in different places on Second Life. And after one of the installations, the curator called me and said, "Hey, we were able to save a lot of your suns. I can send them back to you." And this is how he sent them back to me, and I was like, "What?" So, like in a bag. So it became a bag of suns, and some friends of mine who called E-Team, they have this project called E-Team. We're doing a thing on Second Life called Second Life Dumpster, where the idea was that software scripted objects on Second Life, if you wanted to get rid of them, you could just delete them. But they built this kind of philosophical or sort of spiritual construct of like, well, what happens to these objects after they die? Like, what happens to them? So they created a dumpster, and they attached decay scripts to the objects, and they slowly decay. And these are, you can see the percentages of decay here. And so I gave them my Bago Suns. And it's there decaying on Second Life. And then there was a real life installation at the sculpture center of it. So there's my real life bag of suns in the drawer there. On Second Life, you can force the sunset in the world that you're in. So this is a little movie of, this is actually, I couldn't find the higher res of it, but here's a higher res. And I found this place where they have dolphins jumping. So we can watch a few seconds of dolphins jumping, but the sun, this could actually go on for hours and hours and hours and hours. The sun never changes. So the clouds go by and you can make, whatever. So one of the things that, this idea of, although I loved her work the very best in the show, I started to see other people. This was an installation in China, and I was kind of, am I going, is this?
It's great.
Okay. I don't know if we're running out of time, just tell me.
Good.
Started to see people taking pictures of themselves in front of my work, touching it, leaning up against it, and I was really like, wow, this is amazing. And it was because I was hanging out there that I saw this, and then I decided to look for it. Like, all these people have digital cameras, so I figured there would be digital images. They would upload their images somewhere. And I couldn't find any in China, but then I started to find them in America also. So this is Steve Rhodes' photo stream, and he has lots and lots of photographs of this exhibition at SF MoMA. And he happens to take a picture at the same time that these two guys are taking a picture. And then I started to look more and more, and so, and these are those two guys right there. Oh, wow. On their photo stream. So these are all the pictures that I found of, I have many, many more, but these are some of my favorite. And I realized that they're standing in front of the camera, standing in front of my piece, looking at the camera as though they're in front of the sunset themselves. And so I decided that if they're using, this is the first instance where I've actually used individuals in my work, and can justify it because they're using my work, so I can use them, right? So I actually installed a project at, let me see, I don't have another picture of this. Okay, so this line here of the framed red pieces was an installation at this place, at Mass MoCA. So there was a big installation at Mass MoCA of the suns, and then I also installed these. So, and then I got all of these pictures. So these pictures were on the wall, and then these people came and saw it and took pictures of it, so I found these. So this was an installation, actually. So I decided, there was a show in New York at Columbia University's Teachers College recently. And so I just said, well, why don't you print these out and put them up? So this was what it was. This is, and he took a picture of this and put it on Flickr, which is so perfect. So these are the titles. The first row is people taking pictures of suns from Flickr People, I can't even read anymore. People taking pictures of suns from sunsets from Flickr. So these are the people taking the pictures. Then the second row is the pictures people took of suns from sunsets from Flickr. And then the third is people taking pictures of people in front of suns from sunsets from Flickr. And then the fourth is the pictures people took of those the people in front of suns from sunsets from Flickr. And the fifth is people taking pictures of people taking pictures of suns. You can, yeah. It's even harder than the numbers. So that has become a thing. Like I have that led to this work where I realized, okay, well, it's about being in the whole thing that everybody just does the same thing. And I was thinking about the individual getting lost here. So I started, instead of going in on the sun, actually pulling back and only taking those images where the technology of the camera is actually exposing for the sun, not the people, so the people become secondary. And but I did want to show you. So where's? Let's get. Let's show sidebar. I want to show you. These are all pictures I found online of other people documenting my work in various cases. So I actually don't really need to, I don't need to go and document my work anymore. I can actually just go online and find people's uploads. Okay, so I could stop there, or I could talk about the television project too. I don't, yeah.
It's an interesting place to stop, and just
Yeah.
to ask you a question, is that I was really happy, I said, well, would you mind showing people some of your files? Because I thought it was this sort of metaphor of a museum. This is sort of like the dam, right? You know, this is a place where the digital asset management system. But can you talk a little bit about your organization structure? And, you know, if you'll allow me to continue this metaphor as Penelope as museum, you know, is that, what are your concerns about storing your files and storing your artworks that can have all, you know, that are still as an active artwork? Because I see all of this as still yet an active
It's still,
artwork.
yeah, right.
So can you talk about
Well, I
what your
think-
notions of that are?
I would be the most dysfunctional museum. Like, it would just be horrendous. I was just,
Yeah.
like, if you, oh, what's this? Sorry, I didn't mean to. I mean, I was just like, okay, if we show all the JPEGs, I have 67,000 JPEGs on this computer alone. I have no idea what half of them are, and if I try to find something, I have no idea where it is.
Let me ask the question a different way.
Okay.
You're on a boat in the Sound and your computer goes in the water.
Oh, I have Dropbox.
Okay.
For the most important, but I also, partly why I have like 3 different computers, and all of them have 5 hard drives next to them. And as soon as the hard drive gets used up, I basically put another one on top and start doing the same thing all over again. So I have a huge amount of redundancy, but that's why, I mean, there's an issue. I think a lot of us, well, there's a lot of young people here, but a lot of people my age too. And I think there's something about when I started doing this, I had no idea that it would be my studio. And I had no idea it would be my medium either.
No idea the computer would become your studio.
Yeah. And so, you know, I would label things, all sorts of weird things that just came to mind at the moment of working on them. And then projects would go into one folder, but and the other things would go in there too, and like, oh, it would be like a messy table, you know. I think if I had started today, having, you know, gone through school, maybe doing stuff like this, I would have understood an organizational logic that I never adopted.
Right.
So, but that, yeah. But I do, I mean, there are other things like, with the Sons from Flickr, for instance, I had to keep them all the same titles that as I got them when I downloaded them, because if I renamed them if I renamed them, then I wouldn't know whether I was, when I brought in a new file, whether I was getting the same file or not. So there are no, of these 2013 in this folder, there are no repeats, even though a lot of them look exactly the same.
Right.
So then the one for SF MoMA, that is really SF MoMA's folder. Like I can't put any of those in another folder because there are other things named the same number of a different.
Right. Well, I'd like to give, that's really helpful. I'd like to give Koven a chance to respond to this, but if I could, Koven, just ask one other question. Is that you were talking, and this has to do with, try to make this walk to Anne's point about, you know, an autobiographical work and an
allographic.
Allographic or autographic.
You know,
Such a
I
wrote it
great
down.
distinction.
Okay.
Yeah,
me too.
that was really helpful. And it's
Yeah.
just to say, it seems like your work is somehow between those two in a certain way. But what was interesting, you said in order for this work to be made, it has to be made on a 5-minute or a 1-hour machine. And so,
Well, it doesn't really, but
Okay.
I guess the thing is that the point, you could simulate these images. I could hand print them. I could print them with an inkjet printer, and I could print them on glossy paper and pin them all up on the wall or tape them all up on the wall, and it would look like the installation, but that the machine printer makes also. But part of it is about this idea of the ubiquity of the Kodak, you know, the Kodak moment, or the idea of the scripted photograph. So the idea of hand printing them or printing them myself and putting that kind of love into them actually defies the whole point of that project. The thing that's interesting is how provisional that is to now, right? Like in 100 years from now, they might be manufactured with 3D printers because everything, or nanotechnology, whatever, 100 years from now, it'll be a very different thing. That's a kind of ubiquitous way of making an image. And that kind of, like, taking this project and migrating it into a contemporary equivalent would be fine. It's just, right now, there is no contemporary equivalent to this kind of machine-made thing. The closest to that actually would be if it lived on an iPhone. But I like the materiality, like this kind of transcription from the material of the sun, this hot physical thing that works on you, to this digital immateriality, back to a kind of physical materiality again.
So I mean, I asked that question as a kind of leading thing. I was trying to, in a way, inhabit Jeff here, and to say, as a conservator, this is what I'd want to do, is I'd want to start a conversation with you. I'd want to start a dialogue just to see if we could pull out from you what is the important thing I have to keep, what is the important thing, and how do I start documenting that, how do I start defining that, so that, I mean, we play this game at my museum, the Indianapolis Museum, to say, okay, let's pretend that none of us are here. How are we going to install this? How does that work? Or let's pretend it's 50 years from now or 30 years from now, like, how do you want this thing to work? What's the yes and what's the no? And that can be a difficult thing for a museum, because then we can walk ourselves right into a really cumbersome task that makes reproducing that extraordinarily expensive.
Right. And it strikes me, and actually, Koven, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this as well as yours, Penelope's, and yours, Richard. I think one of the things that we tend to do at museums is to freeze a work of art. And I think that's maybe something we need to rethink. There is a tendency where the market is concerned, and I think also where the valuation placed by museums on objects intellectually privileges what is understood to be the vintage print, which is obviously a photographic metaphor, but the idea that a photographic print made from the negative at approximately the time the negative was made is presumed to have greater value. Authenticity, what have you, than a print even made by the same photographer several decades later. And one recommendation that I've heard from conservators regarding the preservation of time-based media art specifically is that in doing an interview with the artist, one, privilege the artist's intentions at the time the work is donated to the museum or purchased or however it comes in, as opposed to letting the artist subsequently interpret it later on in his or her career. And what's really interesting to me about your piece, and we can debate that, but that's one school of thought. One of the things that I find really interesting about this piece is part of what makes it so fascinating is precisely that you're allowing it to enter into this iterative stream. Where, to my mind, part of what makes the piece so fascinating is that you're finding a way to capture the way that people are responding to it. So it has this living, organic quality that I think might be very challenging. I mean, we'd have to think about how to do it. It is time-based, and it would be yet another way of straining our traditional museum models. I think it would be worth straining them. But nonetheless, we don't tend to do well with things that live and breathe and grow. We tend to want to freeze them in time.
We were having this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very interesting, even though this doesn't affect the room. This will be for posterity. But I mean, what's interesting, particularly about your work, Penelope, is how much it sort of challenges the very idea of best practices in this sense. And one thing we were talking about this in the discussion this morning is that we sort of try to assemble a set of practices for how to deal with these types of works, sort of pretending that there's some commonality to them all that may or may not actually exist. So like, for instance, at the Denver Art Museum, when we're dealing with either born digital works of art or maybe film works that we've migrated digitally, a big part of our practice is how do we establish a very locked down chain of custody to make sure that there's sort of a certification when something moves off of a storage server onto an exhibition server and things like that. Because so many of these works that we deal with, if a copy of it gets out into the wild, the artist sues us or whatever. And yet in your work, sort of the escaping of it is part of the work itself. So I mean, for us, it's that's sort of a practice that we've assembled, and yet that would actually be contrary in this case to your intent to a certain degree.
And I would imagine it will be contrary in the future to a younger generation where
Yeah.
putting your work putting an image online, you're happy if if 1 million people like it or 1 million people take it and reference it somewhere else. Like,
Yeah.
if it goes into a kind of, so that kind of sharing is great as opposed to not, yeah.
Yeah, please, maybe this is the time to open it up for questions, please. And if you don't mind, I'll repeat your question after you say it so it can be recorded.
Okay.
No, don't do that?
No, do that. Make sure the mic's points are
Okay. Towards me. All right, I'll respond to instruction.
What do I do now?
Ask the question, please.
Actually, we might need to discuss this for 20 more minutes. Can you hold on for a second?
Museum practice, and I may be making a large generalization, but museum practice, especially in conservation, deals with the scarcity of the art object. And Penelope, what you're doing is the antithesis of that, which is the abundance of the art subject. And so it rocks conservation, because scarcity is important. And repetition, is not.
Right. It's also, it's not good for the work. I mean, in terms of collectors or whatever, it rocks the whole notion of value, right? So in the market, but so I only do it with this project.
But it also,
but I mean, this project is about that.
your
so.
whole project, in a way, sort of, it rocks museums, and to say that, like so many times, particularly if an artwork is on loan, we wouldn't allow someone to photograph it. And so, and there's it's been widely debunked that flash photography in front of an artwork actually damages the artwork, and it's been pretty widely debunked by now. But I mean, there's these, but it's still a concern for many museums. People register that concern. But so that your work is, I think it makes us all, as a museum professional and conservator, it makes me scratch my head a lot, and to sort of get my head around, like, what is, wait.
Where is the work?
Yeah, because it's not where is the work, but how do we fit this into what Koven was saying, is that we try to make these constructs of, like, this is how we treat contemporary art and this is what we do, and you can't photograph it and you have to do these things, and you're building on all of those, which is fantastic.
Well, this is something that we did an installation with the artist, the New York artist Dana at Denver, and this was a conversation she and I were having, in that for her, almost all the work is transitional. She's sort of, her work is its evolution is very fluid, in that each work really takes advantage of a different set of affordances, new software, new hardware, new projectors, and so for her, it's like, well, I did that for a while, and then I found something that worked better for me, and now I'm doing this. But for us, as dealing with that work on an institutional level, each one of those transitions is a whole set of practices that we, 800 pages of documentation that we have to put together for each sort of phase of an artist's evolution, in a way. And I think with this type of work, those phases come fast and furious. Most artists are already ditching hardware by the time we even are beginning to understand it from a sort of preservation standpoint.
Other questions? Yeah.
There's another area that is going to be tough for museums to work with, which is the whole intellectual property side. Because when we acquire a work of art from a contemporary artist, we ask them to sign a non-exclusive license that lines out what our rights are, what we can do with the object. If the artist the artist practices involve appropriating other people's art, then that complicates that tremendously. I'm curious, actually, when you put your own work on Flickr, do you put a Creative Commons share alike license on it? Do you put rights reserved, or?
It's share, for sure.
But to me, just to restate the question is, what copyright restrictions do you have for your images when you upload them to Flickr?
None whatsoever, but none on my website either. I mean, I do feel like the internet is like the street. You put it out there, and it's in the public domain. So, if you're going to privilege intellectual property on a certain level, if you're going to privilege the sentiment that Salouet is talking about, that it's in the rule as opposed to the object. It doesn't matter what someone does with my work, because what my work is all of the stuff that's behind what got it to being what it is at the point where you're seeing it. Yeah, so,
I mean, I
Yeah, I'm
get
wondering-
it, but I mean, legally, if you put it on the web, it is in the public domain. I mean, you own the rights to it unless you actively give it away.
yes, but nobody is prevented from, it's not like a single chair that I put out on the sidewalk that if someone takes, it's no longer there. So you can't actually see that it's gone. You can't see that someone's using it. Anybody can use it, even though there might be rights associated with,
And actually, I might just speak for a quick moment, putting on another hat that I wear, which is president of College Art Association. One of the things that we're working on right now actually is a practice to establish fair use guidelines for publishing, curating, and creating material that incorporates third-party copyrighted works. And one of the things that I think is extremely interesting, and this actually has a lot to do with variable media art in general, or digital art, is not so much that the problems didn't exist previously, but that new pressure is being put on existing categories. And as a curator myself, and at the Portrait Gallery, we acquired Shepard Fairey's Hope Portrait of Obama in 2008. So we came face to face with this problem of appropriated images pretty fast. And I think that you're right, that there is a concept called fair use, which is not yet, it's not terribly well defined. And I think that there is a growing recognition that in order for creative practice to move forward in many different arenas, it is incumbent upon us as practitioners, I think, to establish a set of guidelines or best practices, if you will, that if not necessarily laws in and of themselves, can at least give guidance to jurists or, gatekeepers who have to make decisions about when it's appropriate to let something go or when is it appropriate to license something. And I tend to agree with Penelope that I think one does not want to clamp down too much on the ability for the free flow of images, and the internet does seem to be a very interesting arena
you can't.
for that.
I mean, part of the problem really is that if you tried to, you'd fail. It is a new culture of sharing and mashup. We're so embedded in it, or it's so embedded in everything that we do that there's no stopping
Well,
it.
and
I know there was a question, but can I just make a statement and then maybe your question? But is it for a museum? What's at stake? I was just looking the other day at the 2010 AMD statistics to say who's making money off their rights to reproductions. Is it money that's at stake? And for maybe the top 10 institutions, there is money there. But it seems to you get down top 3, or is he? Maybe. You get down to the 20. Yeah, let's say you get down to the rest. It's probably the amount of money that the institution is making on rights reproductions probably doesn't fit the amount of money they're spending on staffing that person to watch it. It'd be my guess, but sorry, yeah.
That's okay. I'm really fascinated about this, and especially by this idea that museums as well as artists have sort of built themselves up around this idea of immortality, right? The museums pretend that what they're stewards of is in a way immortal, it's valuable and creates and that you will take care of it for eternity. And this is a cliche, but for an artist, that's sort of the highest good to be achieved because then you look for it as well, and you sort of turn this completely upside down. So my question is, if you're recycling content and creating content from that, which I think releases its value in the moment, and then at some point, quote-unquote becomes irrelevant. It becomes recycled into other content. And are you content with that notion that what you're doing has an impact right now, but as the work itself, the lasting impact, or the impact that goes forward, is just as stuff that got recycled by other people, and your name will sort of fade in that chain of getting recycled and recycled?
If I could just try to restate the question for the microphone, but just to say...
I dare you.
I'm going to say the question dealt with notions of immortality as it relates to preservation, and your work seems to hit that pretty head on, and to say that it's not necessarily about having one thing that's static and fixed, but something that has a potential, if not a responsibility, to evolve.
and then my own sort of where is my own mortality then is at stake, because I think you're right that maybe the deeper reason that artists are artists is because there is that kind of immortal aspect to the objects that they make, but it's not something we really think about. I don't think about it, and I think in fact it comes more out of dealing with certain anxieties of a current moment. And so maybe at this point our anxieties around mortality are less grave than the anxiety around multiple ubiquitous torrents of images that question ideas of uniqueness and individuality. So in a sense, one might give up one thing for another. But I also think that there's an aspect to immortality in this as well. It's like I put it out there, and it is kind of like the 12-year-olds now that get excited when millions of people take their images and retweet them or tumble them or whatever they're doing with them. That I like having this Google image, this Google alert, and when my name comes up, it's like, oh, So I don't know. It's not like, I think it is about giving up one thing and getting another. Yeah.
Can I ask to switch gears just to say is that I really appreciated Koven and Anne's thoughts, and I want to sort of push this thing to what a web page might look like, or what you all would think about a web page that had information in there that would guide museums on how to care for it. As someone who's been involved with the Time-Based Media Art Initiative for a while, I'm curious to feedback on that notion and what you all would think about that.
Yeah, I'd love to get that too. One quick thing I might just like to throw into the mix, if I may too, though, is this paradigm of fixedness that I think is so rooted in museum practice. The idea that somehow we're supposed to freeze something in time and lock it, as you say, Koven, to lock it down. And that's sort of, I think, certainly a standard conservation practice or ideal, certainly coming out of the, you'll have
kind
this,
of, yeah.
But at any rate, as somebody who is in a department of prints and drawings, we are sort of constantly trying to make sure things don't fade and so forth. And to my mind, it really does represent a major paradigm shift, at least from a curatorial standpoint, that we would be willing to accept into our collections and artwork that we know is always going to change. And it's one thing, I guess, even to think about, transferring that media and updating it all the time, but then, Penelope, to think about a work like yours, if we were to bring it into the museum collection, as something that would be growing and evolving and changing all the time. Zoos do that. And I mean, I mention this because maybe there are people who have zoological collections, but I think that there may be some really interesting ways in which we can reach beyond our standard practices and paradigms to begin rethinking what we mean by a work of art.
Can I just say a bit about zoos? Zoos are accredited museums in many cases, and they keep, I forget the name of this book, but they keep books about every animal in the zoo, and it would go back and it would track every single person that, I guess this is genealogical record. And so when you had your leopard in your zoo, you would be able to trace from all of the other leopards that it came. And so then, this is to ensure genetic diversity. And so I'm a zoo and I have my leopard and it has this kind of thing, and then Koven's another zoo, and so the idea is that, well, we need more leopards. And so then they would make these two leopards together based on their book, and I forget the name of the book, but it's a really interesting analogy when we start to apply it to yours, is you can kind of like, in a way, trace out the genealogy of your work, and it allows for a scope of performance.
It's an interesting question also in terms of responsibility. Like the museum really has been seen to be the responsible entity in this context of like preserving, but like I didn't take that screenshot of the Kodak page, and from now on I will, of every single page that I do. But like, to understand that these things are going to change so rapidly that I have to start being more responsible myself as an artist is something that artists haven't really thought they had to do.
Yeah, well, and I think that gets actually back to Anne's point about allographic versus autographic work, in the sense that, like, for a museum, for us, it's way easier to deal with allographic works. A set of instructions where it's like, okay, I can update the hardware, I can update the software, you know, it, like, as long as it basically looks the way it's supposed to, it kind of, the mechanics of it don't matter, you know, versus, wait, or maybe I'm switching those, whatever.
I would argue.
Okay.
Are you sure?
Let me look at my notes.
Allographic allows you to redo it later and call it the same thing.
Yeah, if
Not
it's
thinking also in terms of
purely
performing
allographic.
arts. I mean, the zoo 20 years later doesn't have a leopard anymore. But it has all the records and photography
But-
of the leopard, and
right.
some documentation.
But it may have baby leopards at that point. So the idea of leopard is being carried forward.
Wow.
And a new leopard.
Except you don't deal with a leopard as much as an object as you do a piece of art. I mean, you know, art as object, as a physical object. As an artist, I think of art as process, and most museum practices art as result.
Right.
And so I think, honestly,
Yeah.
the root of all of these problems is the connection of museums to the art market. And you like that, Lee? Okay. And that because value, and I speak of monetary value, but also value historically, is assigned to this object, then you get into the problems of the, what was it, the autographic. You know.
I looked at my notes, I was right.
You were
Right, and so you get into the conundrum of autographic, you know, maintaining this thing, and it really is a whole paradigm shift when you're talking about.
Yep.
And actually, I think the art market brings up a whole other thing that I think we have to deal with these works in a way that's kind of unusual and very new for museums, in the sense that beyond just the art market, there's sort of the manufacturing market. Like, we're so much, I mean, like, we're in a situation where artworks are actually reliant on vendors, and vendors continuing to produce certain types of materials in order for the work to survive. You know, less so, well, actually, no,
Well,
that's
no,
true with you, with
yeah.
Kodak, you know,
I mean,
essentially.
what's interesting about that is it's reliant on a mass market as opposed to a sort of, you know, yeah.
Look what's happening in traditional photography.
Well, that's exactly,
I mean,
yeah.
paper, you know, film.
And there's a question back here.
I guess, I mean, this conversation is super interesting. I think that there actually is a field that is already dealing with some of these issues, but because it's not tied to the traditional art market, it's not struggling with them as much, and it's actually public art. And the public art field, I think, is much farther along in the museum field in accepting the concept of lifespan for artwork, and of the exceptioning artworks when they've reached the end of their lifespan. But that's because public art is behind the art market in the same way that museums are, which is that I represent the public art collection, and we are self-insured, which means that when something goes away, it just goes away. And do we try to document it? Absolutely. We have our art historical. Our shared cultural heritage. But we don't struggle as much with the idea that something might have a lifespan, that we might, for instance, if you have a painting, even something basic as a mural painting at an elementary school, the years to develop is often 20 years.
Well, I want to be careful about pushing that metaphor too far. Partially because I think, with a lot of variable meter work, I mean, not all of it, obviously, but a lot of it, we can't really address the issue of deterioration in quite the same way. As we were talking about this morning, I mean, the practice of conservation, in its essence, is saying, well, if we knew this artwork was going to deteriorate to be unviewable in a 50-year time span, our job is to make sure that that point occurs at 150 years, right? Same with public art, even if we're just sort of accepting that, that the work is going to deteriorate. Here, we don't have that certainty in that we're not looking at a gradual deterioration of a lot of these works. We're looking at a state transfer from it works to now it doesn't work. You could view it, and then the day after that, something broke and you can't.
Kodak.
Exactly. So I mean, I think that's valuable, and I don't mean to say that I'm throwing a blanket on that, but I also think that the issues are not quite as parallel as we might initially think.
I'd also like to add to that I'm involved in a public art project right now, actually, and it's really exciting. And one of the aspects of it, well, first of all, in terms of copyright, I had to get them to rewrite the contract because it didn't apply to my work, and that took a year. But the other aspect is that if I had to work that way, because it is being manufactured on many levels, because it really needs to last exactly 100 years. If I had to work that way, I would not be able to make the work that I make. And so there is, the things that you're dealing with do work for certain kinds of work, but would not work for half of what I do, and then I would feel quite stifled by how I work if I had to think about conservation on that level. So, yeah.
I think we're gonna end it there because it's 3 o'clock, but I thank you all for coming, and I thank the panelists for such a thoughtful discussion.